Okay, so I'm going to get straight to the point with this one. Today marks exactly 40 years since Mao Zedong died. China's infamous Chairman Mao, at least infamous outside China. Sadly, the personality cult of Mao continues in modern China, and I've had some relation to this, some experience of this, insofar as I have seen the Mao portraits, particularly in rural areas. Usually in little huts in the countryside, you still get them widely. There's also a lot of what I would call Mao tack is sold to tourists. I didn't buy any of it because I felt it would be the equivalent of buying Mein Kampf. The Little Red Book, for example, is drenched in blood. It's a book that literally caused the death of thousands upon thousands of people during the Cultural Revolution. The total number of deaths during Mao's regime from a variety of causes, including bloody purges, forced suicides, mass executions, unpreventable famine, is up to 70 million dead. Conservative figures put it at 40 million. Chairman Mao, by that reckoning, by sheer numbers, outweighs Stalin and Hitler as the most blood-stained leader of the 20th century, of modern times. The only figures in history that may come close is Genghis Khan. The only figure, I should say. And if we suppose, as historians suggest, that the total number of dead from the Mongol conquests was something like 40 million, that still is less than the numbers killed by Mao. Put simply, this man killed more fellow human beings than any other person in history, unless you count World War II deaths as being part of Hitler's overall deaths, and that is a matter of debate because there were other actors involved in the total World War II mortality. That's not to excuse Hitler, he was a monster, of course, but I'm focusing on Mao for this. I'm not going to get into a very, very lengthy academic sort of analysis because all the information is out there and there are people who have studied this much more than I have, but I'm going to quote two. Yang Jisheng, Tombstone, whose father, I believe, died in the Great Leap Forward. That was the worst famine in human history. 30 to 40 million Chinese perished between 1958 and 1961, also known as the Three Better Years. Tombstone. Yang Jishen has been called China's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Actually, I think it was the late Harry Wu that was known as China's Solzhenitsyn, but China has a lot of Solzhenitsyns. Another widely praised publication is Mao, the Unknown Story by Yung Chang and John Halliday, and this is accumulated over 10 years of exhaustive research, countless interviews with prominent people. Um, even even the most generous Mao defenders cannot deny, they simply cannot deny that atrocities occurred during Mao years, because even Mao defenders, notably the Chinese Communist Party, concede in their opinion that he made mistakes. Now there's an inconsistency with this, because on one hand Mao had absolute power, especially during the years of the Cultural Revolution when he turned the party against itself in order to turn China upside down. There's an inconsistency with saying that Mao made mistakes and all the blame was put on the Gang of Four. Now, the Gang of Four had blood on their hands, there's no question about that, but in a sense they were scapegoated for the crimes that Mao undertook himself. The party's reckoning was they could not blame Mao directly for it, so we'll blame the Gang of Four. And leaders like Deng Xiaoping, who were purged from the party and later rehabilitated, the only reason, in my view, that they made excuses for Mao is because they wanted stability in China. So they didn't want this power vacuum at the top. In a sense, it was selfless in terms of their own personal suffering. In fact, the current Chinese president, who has been described as the most powerful leader since Mao, Xi Jinping, was himself part of Mao's policies insofar as he was involved in the Down to the Countryside movement, where perceived privileged urban youth were sent to live with peasants. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But the suffering that occurred under Mao's era, I remember reading about a head teacher in Beijing, I believe it was, who was beaten to death by her own students for saying that she loved them as children, as a mother loves children. Because she was deemed to be counter-revolutionary, she was beaten to death, quite literally beaten to death. Mao brainwashed, poisoned the minds of young people. He stole their youth, brainwashed them to hate their own parents and to turn against the establishment of the ruling Communist Party. As a result, millions of people had their lives ruined forever. Tens of thousands died during the Cultural Revolution through forced suicides, through brutal murders like the one I've just described, savage mob mentality. China in the 1960s was a wild, wild place. Um, and the sort of, well, when people defend Mao, they say they point to things like the 100 Flowers campaign, which was supposedly an experiment in creating freedom of speech. What the 100 Flowers campaign was really, I believe it was 1957, was an opportunity for Mao to expose his critics. This was supposed to be 100 different ideas to flourish, but it was just a way for Mao to find who his critics were and to purge them. Many of those people were later executed. The sheer human suffering that occurred under Mao's regime was appalling. But people, well, one of the main defences used for Mao is that China's population increased in that time. My response to that is, if you're going to measure the morality of a leader by the increase in population, then most countries in history would have benevolent leaders because it's a natural trend that populations increase. But that in no way condones the massive, massive mortality rate that occurred under Mao. Through the Great Leap Forward, through the Cultural Revolution, the man was a monster. And the biggest tragedy is, unlike Stalin and Hitler, especially unlike Hitler, the country in which these crimes occurred still venerates this man. That to me is an utter tragedy that 40 years on, there are still many Chinese brainwashed by the cult of Mao. And if you think that's a derogatory term, consider this. From a very early age, Chinese school children are taught that the Chinese people love Chairman Mao. So although the party concedes that he made mistakes and he was only 70% good, this personality cult is still enacted by the party. I don't know why. It doesn't particularly benefit the party today. But nevertheless, my own theory is that if the Chinese people knew the whole truth about Chairman Mao, they would be furious. Um, the truth is, they're trying to brainwash the young generation by whitewashing history, which is quite typical of the Chinese Communist Party. They're too cowardly to confront their past truthfully, so they embellish the past. They embellish the truth, and it's this mass lie. And this is the single reason. This is probably the number one reason why I hate communist regimes. I could say it's because of all the extreme cruelty and human rights abuses, but the biggest thing is the lies. Because you can say what you want about fascist regimes, but the difference is, in countries that have had fascist regimes, such as Germany, Chile, Spain, they have come to confront their past. They have acknowledged their past, and they do not whitewash their past. In the case of Chile and Argentina, for that matter, they went through democratic processes. Even in other totalitarian regimes in Asia, such as Cambodia, they have begun a process of reconciliation with the Khmer Rouge trials. In pretty much most other parts of the world that have experienced a totalitarian regime, they have begun that healing process. With China, it's different because the very same party is in power. Now, it's true that the party has underwent major changes since the days of Mao, And in many ways, China is a very different country today. And certainly the Chinese people are not subservient, brainwashed ants in the sense that they were during the Cultural Revolution. So in that sense, it is a very different country. But modern China owes much more, in my opinion, to Deng Xiaoping and Sun Zhongshan, the real founding father of modern China, than this mass murderer, Chairman Mao. It should be, in my opinion, Sun Zhongshan, who is on the renminbi notes. If you don't know, he was basically the founding father of the Republic of China in the 1911 revolution. In my opinion, he done a lot more for modern China than Mao did. In a sense, he was the Lenin to Mao's Stalin. So I'm going to round this up. I think it is sad that there are still many people who venerate Mao. There are many Chinese who do know the truth. It's not a case that everyone is brainwashed. There are people who know the truth. And there's many young Chinese who couldn't care less about Chairman Mao. But unfortunately, the cult does persist. I've been to his home city of Changsha. It's not actually where he was born, but it's a city that he's closely associated with. And you can find the statue, Big Mao statue there. There's statues of him all over China. The cult does persist because a few years ago there was some young students who tore up portraits of Chairman Mao, and they were punished for that. I don't know if they got custodial sentence, but they were certainly fined for it. Recently, there was going to be a concert or concerts to mark his life in Sydney and Melbourne. I'm pleased to say those concerts were cancelled. Quite honestly, if there was a statue put up of Chairman Mao in London, I would be willing to vandalise it, and I would be willing to be fined for that. Because I don't think it's bad enough that he is still celebrated in China. No other country should be celebrating this mass murderer. Um, Chairman Mao, and this was not a case of making terrible mistakes. He knew what he was doing, and he wanted to turn China upside down to consolidate power for himself. This guy was a complete Machiavellian madman. In a sense, he was a genius. He wasn't an idiot. He knew how to consolidate that power. People point out, he was a great calligrapher and all the charisma of his personality. Western Western intimates who knew Mao all point out that he had real charisma, but very often dictators do. Yeah, they said the same things about Stalin. But the world needs to know the truth about this man, and not the communist censored version. You cannot trust state-sanctioned publications in China to tell you the truth about Chairman Mao, because the fact of the matter is Chinese history textbooks are totally whitewashed. I've looked at children's textbooks, and it is really unfortunate that they teach children from a very early age, that Mao was a great man who was loved by the Chinese people. And there is no moral equivalency here, because you do not get, to provide an example, British textbooks saying the British Empire was wonderful for the Indian people. You do not get the same level of brainwashing. You just don't. You do not get German textbooks saying Hitler was a great man that the German people loved. No, they are ashamed of Hitler, and rightly so. So this is something that is almost unique in China, this cultivation of this personality cult. Of course you get it in North Korea, and the nutty regime there has just once again tested the world's patience. Guess which is the only country that supports North Korea? China. Although I will say even the Chinese must be getting frustrated with these constant nuclear tests. But anyway, I'm going to round that up. Those of us who have actually bothered doing our homework know the truth about Chairman Mao. And, it doesn't make me special. Many people do. Many Chinese do. Brave figures like Yang Jisheng and Yuan Shang, who now lives in Britain. She's had to get British citizenship because if she lived in China, she would undoubtedly be harassed by the authorities. China is not a tolerant society when it comes to dissent. Um, you know, Chinese nationalistic critics will always say, oh, but there's dissent within the Chinese cyberspace and people can criticize the government. So the point is that is done within a structure that is still very much controlled. So yes, people can criticize the government at a low level basis. And there is certainly more dissent allowed today than there was in the past, which is to be welcome. But the point is, the communist regime still completely censors its own history. There are still things that you cannot openly discuss without repercussions. Um, China has a very, very long way to go when it comes to transparency. And I believe that China will be a changed country when the statues of this mass murderer are finally pulled down. Whether that be on the 50th anniversary or the 60th anniversary, I don't know. But hopefully one day, I don't see it happening under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has made it quite clear. In the very early days, there was some hope that he would be a reformer. Not a chance. Leading up to the G20 in Hangzhou, it was quite clear that Xi Jinping's China is going to be just as authoritarian as any regime before it. There may not be the mass murderer on the scale of the Mao days, but certainly in terms of not tolerating dissent, it is as bad as it's ever been. China is a great, great country and it deserves better than this. And I'm not speaking from an anti-China. If you are Chinese and you're a Mao apologist, well, frankly, there's not much I could say because I find that people who are Mao apologists, just like people who are Kim Jong Un apologists, there's no getting through to them. This is not the consensus, by the way, of all Chinese people. And that's a big difference with North Korea, whereas North Koreans really are. North Korea today is like China was under Chairman Mao. Um, but his policies were an utter and complete disaster. The worst famine in human history, massive level political persecutions. Um, there's no vindication for what this man done. As for creating the modern China, like I say, it was Sun Zhongshan and Deng Xiaoping deserve a lot more credit for that. So we'll leave it there. 40 years since the great tyrant died.